breaking the consensus here. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And first of all, before we start, I'd like to ask you to hit the subscribe button. Any new material that we produce, you will be advised of. And at the bottom there, you'll see the donate button. If you can help us in any way, we would really appreciate it. Tonight, we are joined from across the ocean, across the Atlantic, by Tom McClusky. Thank you, Tom. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be back.
And how's spring in Washington?
It's beautiful weather. Congress is out of session for Easter week, and as I mentioned before, since we hoisted Joe Biden onto you guys for this week, the Washington D.C. is a nice and safe place right now.
As somebody said, I can't remember who it was Buckley or Quine or somebody said that stopping congressmen from doing their job was much the same as protecting your child from a bear. It wasn't so much a good idea, it was a moral duty. The less they're doing, the less damage they can do.
Will Rogers, who was a Democrat and a humorist back in the 1920s, American humorist, used to say that when Congress is in session, it's kind of like when a baby has a hammer. You just never know what kind of damage is going to happen.
We could continue that line. I'm reminded now of the Mark Twain quote. Was it, dear readers, imagine you were a member of Congress, or imagine you were an idiot. But I repeat myself. Anyway, I'm sure that's not fair. I'm sure there are very many fine, upstanding, committed, dedicated intellectual members of the House and of the Senate. Ladies and gentlemen, fine, upstanding people. But we're talking here tonight about Joe Biden, because, as you say, Joe Biden is about to grace us with a visit, and parts of the country and all of the media is absolutely fascinated by this Irish Catholic president. He's our second Irish Catholic president since John F. Kennedy, because Ronald, of course, was an Episcopalian. So let's start. Give us a sense of Joe coming into politics, his background, who he is, what kind of person Joe is.
Well, Joe Biden, I mean, he's been in politics for a very long time, longer than possibly either of us were alive. Started in the early 70s. It was when he first got elected to Congress. And at the time he ran, he embraced his Catholic faith. He ran as a pro-life person. I mentioned, I used to work at a place called the March for Life, the big march that happens every January. I used to work there. We had photographs of him in the early 1980s fundraising for the March for Life and for Human Life Amendment to ban all abortion in the United States. However, once he got higher aspirations, first in the Senate and then running for president, he started to lose a lot of those pro-life and also he kept his Catholic identity, but lost a lot of what the Catholic teachings tell you. That by the time he ran for president, he fully embraced the abortion agenda. He's fully embraced those who this same-sex type agenda. Things like gay marriage, and to the point right now where he believes that men should compete in women's sports, and use bathrooms, and that children as young as 12 should be able to get government funded surgeries that forever alter them. So
he starts off. He's born, I think, originally in Pennsylvania. On his father's side, they're a mixture of English and Huguenot. I think Biden actually is an English name, English or French name, with Huguenot connections. He's Irish on his mother's side, as I understand it, but he doesn't. He ends up in Delaware. He starts his political life first in Congress, and then later on in the Senate in Delaware. Is that right?
Right, and not in his defense, but in defense of those of us who are of Irish descendancy, nobody in the United States is a little bit Irish. If you have if you have Irish in your blood and in your ancestry, then most of us fully embrace it.
I mean, this is not to the point, but it's a curious thing, and I think maybe the listeners will be interested in it. The three largest ethnic groups in the United States are English, German, and Irish, right? And I've seen numbers which suggest that what you say is in fact the case, that many Americans have a great multiplicity, a great diversity of ethnic heritage. You could have somebody who has Italian, Polish, Jewish, German, Irish, but there's a strong tendency when you go for people to decide, oh, I'm Irish, and then you have the Irish, and then you have the Scots-Irish down in Appalachia in the south as well. Do you have any notion why it should be the case that? Is it just because people like to go out on St. Patrick's Day and get an excuse to have maybe one more beer than they would normally have?
I think it's a little, and this is from my own personal experience, and one, I always thought there were two main groups in the United States: those who were Irish and those who wished they were. But I think it's the English have always kind of been the oppressors historically and everything. The Germans, they have a pretty shaky history as well, but the Irish, it's just almost romantic. They fought against they were the first to fight against the English oppressors. They were many of the Irish who came here my own ancestors were forced out because of English oppression. So I think it helps develop a closer connection. And when the Irish came over here, I mean, they contributed so much. They were the working class right away. They were the police officers. They were the firemen. They were the part of the ethnic groups, probably the only like white ethnic groups building the railroads across the United States. So I think there's just an attraction to it. And then you add in the fun part too. The Irish are known as the fun people, fun loving. I don't want to get into stereotypes, then you start getting offended. But I mean, the St. Patrick's Day celebrations are kind of reflective of that, maybe an over characterization of that fun, that it only revolves around alcohol. But the music and the culture, and I mean, there's the reason there's a book out there called "Why the Irish" or "How the Irish Saved Civilization."
Cahill.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose then there's this, as you say, there's the music and the poetry and the novels, and so there's the romance of the culture. Yeah. So Joe, as you say, he's been in politics a very long time. He comes in as the junior senator in Delaware in 1972. And Nixon is president, Vietnam is one. This is a very long time ago, as you said. He starts off with this strong sort of Catholic identity. He's pro-life, he supports the March for Life, etc. And then he evolves. Can you give me just a sense, in 1972, was it yet the case that support for abortion had become a shibboleth, a test act, if you like, within the Democratic Party? Or was the Democratic Party still a coalition where it was possible to be pro-life or to be pro-abortion?
Well, by the time Roe v. Wade in 1973 legalized abortion on demand all across the United States, it looked like the Republican Party was about to become the pro-abortion party. Richard Nixon was pro-abortion. Henry Kissinger, I mean, a lot of people in his administration were. Ted Kennedy considered himself pro-life at the time. Joe Biden considered himself pro-life at the time. You had a few, most of them of Irish descent, like Henry Hyde, politicians who were Republicans, were pro-life. I mean, it was mostly a Catholic thing at the time. And Jimmy Carter, when he ran, he kind of gave a bow to the pro-life cause, but then completely turned his back on it as president. And it wasn't until Ronald Reagan insisted that within the Republican platform that one of the planks be pro-life.
at that time, even people who would be perceived as being radical, slightly more radical element, like I think at that time, Jesse Jackson would have been pro-life, for example. Am I right?
He was pro-life until 1988, and he still, even today, like on things like assisted suicide or things along those, there was a famous case well over a decade now, Terry Schiavo, who was, her husband starved her to death. She was,
Yes.
and Jesse Jackson was one of those people who went down and spoke out on her behalf during that case.
Reagan makes this decision, you see, to make it a part of the platform when Reagan gets the nomination in 1980, defeats Carter. Now, to be slightly cynical, okay, is that, for, do you think, for Reagan, a choice that he makes which is purely a choice of, shall we say, of principle, or is that part of Reagan's evolution of the Nixon, southern state policy strategy of seeing that you've got this culturally conservative bloc of voters in the state, and he wants to speak to them? So, or is it a mix of both? It's politics. It can be the right thing and the right thing.
I mean, it's easy to glamorize look at, because when you're looking in the rearview mirror. And I'm a big fan of Ronald Reagan. When he was governor of California, he was pro-abortion. He would call himself pro-choice, and he actually passed a pretty obnoxious pro-abortion law while he was governor, and he later regretted it. And I think that regret was sincere. He hired a lot of good people. Carl Anderson, who used to be the Supreme Knight of the, who just recently retired Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, worked for him. Gary Bauer, who's a very famous pro-life advocate here in the United States. And the only sitting president to write a book while in office was Ronald Reagan. And that book was on the issue of abortion. It was called Abortion and Conscience of a Nation. So from people, I only met the man once, very, very briefly when I was young, except for people I know who worked with him for years. It was a passion for him. That we talked about Joe Biden evolving into a pro-abortion. Joe Biden more devolved. Ronald Reagan evolved. He was pro-abortion, thought it was a woman's right to issue, and evolved into understanding that the best avenue for both the woman and child is life.
It's a curious thing, I think, for people who are looking at the United States and looking at history, the evolution of the idea, because if we look at the 60s, and we've said, for example, people like Jesse Jackson, I think would be, I'm right to say Martin Luther King would have been pro-life. The name escapes me now. The editor of the Catholic Worker, Doris
Day, or no, that's the actress.
I want to say that's Doris Day. Was what's stuck in my head, but you know what I mean anyway.
Yes,
a very prominent, so Christian socialist type, again, very much part of that pro-life movement. And in the Republican Party, you would have what we, I suppose, today might still, people of my generation call Rockefeller Republicans.
Yes,
very much would have been in that pro-choice, pro-abortion side. So for like the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s. So Biden comes into a party, and he devolves as the Democrats, in a sense, devolve, would you say? Where is there a point where we can say at this stage he becomes pro-abortion, and in a sense and reflects what's happened to the Democratic Party? He runs for the nomination in 88. By the time we get to 88, has he made that devolution, that degeneration into the pro-abortion state, or before that?
Not fully. And I mean, even during the original primaries in 2020 or 2020, he mentioned with pride that he voted for something called the Hyde Amendment, which fights taxpayer funding of abortion. Mm-hmm. Except, however, when he was vice president under Barack Obama, he praised China's one-child policy, which relies, of course, heavily on abortion. And I think he more reflects while the Republican Party evolved into a pro-life party, more or less, we hope, more pro-life than certainly the other, the Democratic Party, it was a forced evolution. There were used to be about 30 or 40 members of the House of Representatives who were Democrats and considered themselves pro-life. But once the healthcare law called Obamacare passed, a number of them voted for taxpayer funding for abortion. The few that voted against it, like a Dan Lipinski, were run out of office. They were primaried and run out of office. So it's made very clear that at any level, if you want to run for national office as a Democrat, be it as a congressman to president, you need to swear fealty to the pro-abortion cause.
It's pretty well, it's across the board. If I'm remembering rightly, there was a governor of Pennsylvania, Casey,
Bob Casey Sr.,
who lamented the fact, he said that the party had become so univocal on it that for someone like him, even though he's a prominent governor of a large industrial state, very important state, for him, he couldn't even get on the top table at conference.
And his son, Bob Casey Jr., ran for the Senate in Pennsylvania and still is a senator today. He's running for re-election. And he kind of gave a wink and a nod to pro-lifers. He was running on his dad's coattails on that issue, except while in the Senate, he has voted for every pro-abortion initiative to come across his desk. Anything that was about to become law that pushed the issue of abortion, including the whole mandate against Catholic nuns, forcing them to pay for contraception. He voted in support of it, and he denounced the overturning of Roe v. Wade when it happened.
You mentioned Obama there. Obviously, Biden was Obama's VP, and there was a case that garnered quite a lot of notoriety, where there was the Little Sisters of the Poor, who provide healthcare for the very poor, the indigent, refused to pay for abortifacients and contraceptives, and they were sued under Obamacare. They lost federal, and they eventually, if I'm right, they won their case in the Supreme Court.
And it was a very strict ruling that only affected them. So currently, his Health and Human Secretary, Joe Biden's the current one, Javier Becerra, another person who identifies as Catholic, has no healthcare experience prior to coming to the Health and Human Services Department. He was Attorney General for California, and what he was well known for was suing Catholic nuns in California to try to force them to also pay for contraception and abortifacients. And they're now trying to do it again. And in addition, the new what is it, Golden Idol is transgender surgery for minors, permanently disfiguring and in many cases sterilizing children for the sake of those who misgender themselves. And they're trying to get taxpayers to pay for this for kids as young as 11 or 12 years old.
That's a subject I want to come back to a little bit later, because there's something very strange happening there in the States. I want to have just get your take on. But has he ever addressed the issue? Okay, with leaving aside whatever position he has decided to arrive on, whether it's out of a change of mind of principle, or whether it's simply the way the wind has blown politically, that he had gone from being pro-life to being a pro-abortion. It just, how has he addressed the issue of conscience rights? Because surely, I think that if the Catholic Church is the largest, if not the largest, one of the largest providers of healthcare in the United States, and certainly one of the largest providers of healthcare to people who are poor or indigent, people without insurance, and he seems to be willing to shut down healthcare if they say out of conscience principles they can't comply with these kinds of laws. How does he square that? How does he work around? surely these, I mean, these the liberals, they always talk about conscience right and individuals and the right to autonomy and all that, and they're big into civil rights. But surely conscience rights here is a really fundamental thing in a democratic republic. Does he address that?
He leaves it up to others in his administration to address it, and it's the Catholic Church in the United States is the biggest provider of healthcare services. They run most of the larger churches, and there's an attack brewing against them. That, by the way, did you not know that Catholic churches don't provide abortions and things along those lines? The media is starting to pick up on that and attack them. But it's not just hospitals he's willing to shut down. There's one of the largest contributors to adoption as well as the Catholic Church in the United States. They want to shut that down. Pregnancy care centers, which are ecumenical. There are some Catholics, some evangelical, there are some of other faiths. And what they're doing, they're basically maternity homes. And this administration wants to shut them down as well. There have been over 300 attacks on Catholic churches and pregnancy care centers since he took office. And the Department of Justice has done very little to nothing in defending those facilities.
Okay, we understand what the position of the Democrats will be. We understand what the position of the mainstream media, generally speaking, will be on these things. But I think pretty well anybody who knows that the Catholic Church exists, even if they know nothing about them, oh, Catholics are against abortion. That's a thing for Catholics. They're opposed to abortion. This is one of their fundamental principles. How do you think non-Catholic Americans see this when they see this kind of attack on, say, Catholic health care? If you're a poor woman or a poor man in eastern Kentucky or in Tennessee, and you want to get, and they're going to close down your healthcare, do they see this as problematic, or is it just, well, no, they should be forced to do it? Do you have any sense of what the sort of the opinion of this with ordinary Americans might be?
I think this administration, it's a complicated issue, and I think this administration preys on that, and that a lot of people don't understand that, and there's a false belief that abortion is healthcare. So what these churches are doing, our church-run hospitals are doing, are denying actual healthcare. It's something that we have not, I think you guys are facing it as well, but it's something we've pushed back enough, I think, against, that abortion is not healthcare by any means. If one of your patients always dies in the end, that is not healthcare. I think I think politicians like Joe Biden, who loves, he says he goes to church on a weekly basis. He when originally asked, when he first got elected president, and his press secretary would always be asked, how does he reconcile as a Catholic also being pro-abortion? And he'd respond, his press secretary would respond, well, he's a devout Catholic, without and they wouldn't be pressed on that. Nancy Pelosi would try to expound on it, which was even worse. There are a number of Catholic bishops in the United States who I think speak articulately on the subject and call them out. Cardinal DiNardo is one who's out on the West Coast in California. I think I always want to see more, of course, but Archbishop Lori, who's in Baltimore, Maryland, and there's a number who aren't as well known, but there are also a number of bishops who are willing to turn a blind eye because he's a politician, because it's a difficult subject to talk about, and it hurts sometimes living our faith hurts our popularity, and that's
the problem that appeared under the first iteration of Obamacare, and which led to the prosecution of the Little Sisters of the Poor, has raised its head again. There's a new proposal now uh, to change the legislation under Obamacare, which would actually force Catholic hospitals. Now, the Episcopal Conference in the United States has come out in opposition to this and condemned it. What's the response been of the administration?
The Catholic Church has come out against it as well. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, they've been very strong against it. The administration, they say they're looking for compromise, but is a compromise more resembling they want us to be the Neville Chamberlain type in the situation where they keep on coming to us with the exact same proposal, saying accept this, it's a compromise. But what's going to happen? I mean, there's going to be more lawsuits. There's currently lawsuits. There are certain states like California where there's ongoing lawsuits where they're being forced to pay. Catholic churches are being forced in their insurance to pay for abortions. All abortion plans in places like Illinois and California, and I think Washington State, New York State, are being forced to pay for abortions. So a lot of it is ending up in the courts. And I do think it goes back to, I think it would be good if the Catholic Church sat back and just created a list and said, okay, it's an anecdote from when I was in college. I went to a small town in upstate New York for college, and there were 2 colleges in that town. And the people who lived in the town were sick and tired of these kids who overran the town like 7 months of the year. So what the 2 deans of the colleges did was give out, like in exchange, they gave gold coins to all the kids and said, buy everything with these gold coins, these $1 coins. And eventually the people who lived in the town like backed off because they couldn't, all the dollar coins that were being spent. We need something similar like that for all the Catholic Church provides to the world, but here in the United States needs to be articulated better. And shown that hospitals, adoption, feeding the poor, and the government can't handle stuff like this. This is why the church exists, is feeding the poor and housing the homeless. If that goes away, we as a society go away. Government cannot step in and fill those roles.
I think that's a really, really a very good point. I think not just in the United States, not just in Ireland, but globally, if you're talking about healthcare, you're talking about social welfare, you're talking about homelessness, people with substance abuse, drug addiction, also everything that where people are in need all across the world. The church has become this punching bag, and I think there's a lack of awareness of just this sheer mass of what the church is doing, and that if people are a little bit more aware of it, then they might be a little bit more, well, it's not necessarily appreciative, but a bit slower to get involved in activities that might actually shut it down, particularly when there's no uppity. I don't want to go back too far in history, but we know that after the dissolution of the monasteries back in the 16th century, that, for example, literacy declined in England because the kids didn't have schools. Only the people could pay for schools, so the poor kids couldn't have schools. Homeless weren't housed. The people who were traveling didn't have anywhere to stop to get food. There was a huge vacuum left in those countries across Europe where the church disappeared, the monasteries disappeared. I think we could see that same thing happening again.
Right. I mean, in the United States, there is no organization called agnostic or atheist charities. It doesn't exist. There is something called Catholic Charities, and the work they do is unparalleled. There are other faiths like Samaritan's Purse for some evangelicals, and the Red Cross. It's not called the Red Box. It's called the Red Cross for a reason. These things cannot be, as I said before, they cannot be done by government.
Just speaking of the other churches, presumably, I mean, the Catholics aren't the only faith group that have a position on this. Have any of the other faith groups voiced opposition here? I mean, have we seen? I know, there's pretty extensive charitable outwork from, say, the Jewish community. I'm sure, have we heard anything from the Orthodox Jewish community, from evangelical Christians who are involved in the same kind of work and are suffering, are being attacked, suffering the same kind of pressure, shall we say?
Um, I'm not as conversant within the Jewish faith. I do have many partners who are Jewish and Orthodox Jews. They aren't as well organized, and you find that across many of the different faiths. I mean, one of the curses of the Catholic Church is its hierarchy. One of the blessings of the Catholic Church is its hierarchy. It allows them to be very well organized, except a lot of Baptists in the United States have come to the defense of religious freedom. A number of Lutherans, a number of Anglicans as well. So it is a very ecumenical, and also the Muslim faith. A lot of it is, a lot of them, when it comes to cultural issues, a lot of them hold the same beliefs. So I see it more at the United Nations level, except it is true that the closer you are to your faith, the more likely you are to believe in what either Bible, Quran, or Torah tell you.
What has been the reaction of the institutional church, not just to Joe Biden, although obviously Joe Biden is the most prominent Catholic political figure, but you got Nancy Pelosi, you got lots of others who take a very public position on abortion when it comes to, say, participation at Mass or receiving communion. Is there any kind of consistency? Has there any? What has the position been? That's not an easy question. I recognize that.
Yeah, and I do think, and God bless him, but I do think the leadership, or maybe lack of leadership, from Pope Francis on these issues hurts. However, I always want them to see them do more. Except the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has led on a number of these issues. Individual bishops who, like I mentioned before. The new head of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is also the head of the military archdiocese, Archbishop Broglio. I've known him for decades, worked with him on issues within the military, both of life and of marriage. He's very solid. And some of them are willing to speak out. There have been bishops who said, if Joe Biden comes to our diocese, he should not receive communion. And with Nancy Pelosi, her cardinal came under a lot of fire for putting out a public statement saying she should not receive communion. It was the right thing to do, and I'm glad that he did it, except we should be, I want my priest to hold me accountable for my faith. And these bishops, I think, should be more willing to speak out. Not just here, but also in Ireland as well.
I just want to touch briefly, because it's a very complex subject and we don't want to get too deep into it. But you're saying that on the transgender agenda, that he has been, shall we say, very much on the progressive fringes. He's advocating. You were saying about surgeries, for making it illegal to have surgeries on children, use of hormone blockers, cross-sex hormones, this kind of thing. The United States, obviously the cultural wars go on there, as they do across all of the Western world. But we have seen, for example, in the United Kingdom, there's been significant change. The Tavistock Clinic closing down. There was the Keira Bell judgment. We've seen, I think, in Finland, in Sweden, in Norway, lots of countries in Europe, there's been a significant change, which has been driven mostly by the medical community, if you like, as an insistence, no, this is not a scientific approach, this is potentially harmful, this is experimental, etc., etc. The United States seems to be lagging a little bit. It's pushing ahead. So where is Biden on this, and what's happening there? Why do you think it's so hard to see a turn in this?
We those of us who fight on these issues, we try to point to Europe. to show. And on the life issues itself, until Roe v. Wade was overturned, even England had more restrictive abortion laws than the United States did, where it was allowed on demand up until birth. But on the transgender issues, it has become the new. John Hopkins University, which is one of the leading medical universities here in the United States, for years used to fight against these transgender surgeries, even for adults, just pointing out that it's not healthy. It shows no real sign to help the individual who has these surgeries, and in effect they think it does the opposite. But I think it's become more popular. It's gone away from science and gone more populist. And you see on TikTok, like 11-year-old kids at drag shows and things along those lines, or dressed up in drag themselves. And nobody points out the dangers. I mean, I recently got to meet a few young men and women who tried to have transition at a young age. Some of them will now never have children because of the pills they've taken or because of surgeries they've had. Some of them will not grow breasts naturally. And when they go around the United States to try to talk about this, they're met with violence. And as are female athletes who speak out, they are also met with violence. I mean, what was horrible was the week that they're in evangelical school here in Tennessee, there was a shooting of 6 people. And almost immediately the fault was put on those Christians for having, and the shooter turned out to be somebody who identified themselves as trans. Almost immediately, even among the media, the fault was pointing to it's those Christians' fault for having the views that they have. And less than a week later, you had the White House talking about fighting against violence against trans people. It should be violence against this type of violence. None of us should be subjected to. However, the total ignorance of where this is coming from, and nobody is willing to question publicly, maybe it's not a good thing to pump somebody whose body isn't prepared for it full of testosterone. It's a medical question, yet you cannot ask it in the media today without being called a transphobe or a bigot. So it's a very hostile environment here, even more so like when I was involved in the marriage issue back in the 2000s with a group called Family Research Council. And I mean, somebody came into my office building trying to shoot everyone in my office building because of our beliefs. But I'd have to say it's more violent today than it was even then.
Before we finish up, you may or may not be aware, but the president, I'm told, is going to visit Knock Shrine.
I saw that.
Now, there is a tradition in the country of hospitality and being courteous and polite to your visitors. And your visitor, in this case, is the President of the United States. So there's all the more reason to be nice to him, because he's already done us on our corporation tax, and we want to keep it as low as we can. We don't want any more pressure on that. And we want Apple and all the other guys to keep rolling in the billions into our exchequer. But do you think that if you're the Monsignor in Knock, or if you're the bishop, or whoever happens to be in charge of the liturgy, that this is not that it would be a good idea, but do you think that there is actually an imperative here that they should say something? Or do you think that the nature of the political realities, that you just go through the pieties and you say nothing, you leave it go?
I think we should all try to emulate Mother Teresa, who, when she was put in these situations, she was at, I think it was the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast when Bill Clinton was president. And she made a point of looking at Bill Clinton to talk about the most grievous crime that humanity does upon itself, being abortion. Joe Biden, he is always welcome at my church. I mean, any faith hopefully will welcome the stranger, but if he were to, he shouldn't take communion, in my opinion. And it is our leaders who need to speak out, and hopefully it is a chance for the Monsignor to be like, Joe Biden is always welcome here. It's unfortunate, though, that our Catholic brethren in the United States are not given the liberties that your own Declaration and Constitution call for. It's a good opportunity for somebody who might never have a public mic again and of this magnitude to highlight. And Mother Teresa always took advantage of that. And I think, and I don't think what harm could happen if you follow her example, right? I mean, you could just do about anything, and if your parents yell at you when you're a kid, and if your parents yell at you, just be like, it's what Mother Teresa did. It's how do you come out the bad guy on that end?
Well, listen, Tom, it's been great to talk to you. I hope we will have a chance to talk to you again soon on other issues. But for the time being, I'd like to thank Tom. I'd like to thank you, listeners, for having to join us again. Before we leave, if you can click the donate button there, anything you can give will be used to defend those life principles and life causes that we all share. So thank you very much.
I had the honor of hosting a number of your brethren here to introduce them to the U.S. pro-life movement and pro-family movement, and I can't think of a worthier cause in the fire you guys are under. So I would echo your words and please donate.
Thank you for that, Tom, and have a great rest of Eastertide.
You do the same.
Bye-bye.